Hey, the Rulers DMO73 here, and today we're back with a feature match showing off our first draft of Ulga and his army of replicants versus Dan Roland and his first take on Drei with Famine. Let's go ahead and jump right in.
This session brought to you by Odyssey Games for pre-orders and sealed product, CCG Prime for tons of singles and supplies, Cardo Doko for international rulers looking for products, and FoulLibrary.com for articles and wonderful deck lists.
As well as our guest lecturer members King Pearlshine, Vite Ramen, Mognite, and Darren Noblock.
Class is in session.
Okay, so as we get started here, I am on the right playing Ulga Replicants. It is a blue-green with a little bit of extra color just to make Replicant Imul kind of have some other options, but it is a pretty basic Ulga build, really kind of focused on his support for the most part. And Dan is on the left playing a mono-white Drei Famine list, which is kind of a take one on kind of looking at what we would do if we're using the Famine stuff. So we'll see how this goes. I think it'll be interesting to see. One of the biggest things about Drei with Famine is that it wants your opponent to have resonators, and Ulga has a lot of quick cast resonators, so it could be a little bit interesting to see if there's a way for Dan to kind of get rolling, or if he'll have to kind of find other avenues to be able to generate the advantage, or things like, you know, Duet of Light, or Keep the Faith, or Dark Atlas to kind of get stuff to the graveyard to reanimate it, or what we're going to happen there. Beginning of the game, we do get to start with a Magog, which is a wonderful tool. Keep in mind with the errata to sort of progression, we have to protect that Magog now in order to be able to contract. We do hit that Sunstone, so we're going to go ahead and just pass because we don't know exactly what Dan is playing here. He hits one as well. It decides to crack his to get a Stone of Famine. We say that's fine. Goes ahead and uses that stone to then play a flute, which is really nice for being able to manipulate and add +1/+1 counters to things, which is kind of Drei's whole deal. In response to the cast of the flute, we're going to go ahead and try to go get our stone, sort of progression, and then we could choose to try to cancel it or something, but ultimately we're just going to let that fly. We are going to go ahead and in our recovery cast Sword of Progression here just to draw a card and get us to one Sword of Progression. The main reason to do that during our turn is because it also makes Scheherazade a 1 cost for this turn, which is very, very nice. Then we just kind of passed the turn there. We didn't have a Sherry to play, but also, you know, kind of want to see what else Dan is going to be committing to. Again, that same kind of vein. We don't want to put resonators on board if we don't have to, because we don't want to give him fuel for us having Famine. He's going to go ahead and use the flute to put a +1/+1 counter on it so that it can it won't have Famine either, and down comes a Starlit Canopy. Now this would be a pretty big deal to mess with our Magog and just remove it from the game. So it also is a way for Dan to be able to draw more cards, especially since he has that flute. So we're probably going to try to stop this, either whether there being a feasting or a sort of progression to stop it. We'll see exactly what comes down here. We're going to use Persephone to bounce it back to his hand so it will not resolve, and then means that if he does have to try to, you know, kind of tap out at this point to try to recast it if he really wants to go for that play, at which point we do have the feasting in hand to be able to force him to pay one or cancel it. This is kind of the ideal situation for us here. It taps him out. It leaves his flute vulnerable because we're in a position where we can maybe even go in to attack the flute with feasting now that it's tapped to try to be able to kill it and remove some of that ramp advantage that Dan has. Calling it before thinking about what we're going to do to potentially get some value out of calling Stone. We are pretty safe here unless Dan is main decking Angelic Battle Barrier to be able to start kind of going in and making some maybe greedier plays. Gonna go ahead and commit to a sort of progression here in the main phase, just to do the mode to draw a card, but mainly to say that we've cast 2 sorts of progression. This is mainly to let us then cast the Generate Replicants, which lets us get a 2-drop Resonator or less because we've cast the sword twice. And we're gonna kind of cascade a little bit here by grabbing Replicant Scheherazade, who then gets to go get as a Replicant from the deck or the sideboard, and that's gonna grab us Replicant Imul. Now, we did this before calling Stone, so that when we flip over this sort of progression, or this Stone of Progress, Imul will then trigger, and we'll get a free floating will, and we're probably going to use it to produce black. The thought being that we can use that black to apply a neg4 to Dan's board, and we can get that flute off the board once we swing in with Vizjerei. Gonna go in and swing in with that Feasting to the flute, deal 400 damage, and then after that damage is dealt, we're gonna go ahead and apply that neg4 to the board, thanks to Replicant Imul, getting his flute off the board and saying pass the turn. So again, we're the control deck, we're up on will, and we've got access to our the dog to be able to add +1/+1 counters, which will help for some manipulation to keep ourselves from having Famine, or kind of punishing a play that Dan is going to commit to mess with Famine, to then kind of minimize the value he gets off of it. Right now, Replicant Imul is sitting at being a 10/10 because we have 2 stones and 2 rulers. And she's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger. Down comes this hungry, famished wolf. We do have things that have famine, so it only costs him 2. But what we can do is, in response to the cast, to prevent him from being able to swing and kill any of the stuff we have, we can go ahead and use the Child of Famine to put 2 +1/+1 counters on each of our creatures. So then we... he'll enter, but he doesn't have anything to be able to eat. So he has swiftness and precision, sure, but now Imul's a 14/14, or a 12/12. And so that's more than he can deal with currently. So swinging in with that would be a pretty big mistake. The only thing he can kill there is really the Feasting, but like both the Scheherazade and the Imul can stop him. And I'm still up 1 will, and he's the control deck. So a little bit of an unfortunate hurdle to be kind of jumping into for Dan. You do see he does have contract there. It's certainly something that he could choose to go into to reanimate. I don't think he can reanimate the flute, unfortunately, because it doesn't say alternative card. But he could go into contract to then try to get some value off of it that way. Ultimately, though, choosing to just pass the turn, so we're going to draw, use Ulga to kind of or use Magog to kind of continue to sculpt. Gotta love being able to draw 2 cards per turn, really, for hand sculpting. And we're going to see probably a pretty similar line as we saw before. You see we have another Generate Replicant in hand. So we're going to go for probably the same line, where we're going to get a Scheherazade. Scheherazade's going to get us an Imul, and then we're going to generate, if we hit the stone off the top, we're going to generate a second will source just off of hitting the stone because of the 2 Replicant Imuls. So Scheherazade is going to have to get us the Imul from in the deck. We do play a couple copies in the deck, as well as the 1 in the sideboard, just for situations like this, so that we can, you really only need like 2, because... if 1 is in the graveyard, then like in response to her own shuffle effect or search effect, you can put it back in the deck using her tuck effect. There's all kinds of cool things you can do with Sherry. We do hit another of the search stone, but it is a sun protection entity, which is great. So both of these Imuls are going to get to produce this extra will. The reason why this search stone is so good is because we don't need the will right now from the stone. We don't need to worry about that. But what we are going to do, which is helpful, is that we can use that stone during Dan's turn to get another stone, and then trigger the 2 Imuls again, and then use them in a very big way. So using 1 of the will from the Imul, we're going to go ahead and grab Little Maria. The idea with him here being Little Maria is we can call something like End of Book or Sort of Progression, so that every single time we search, we still have access to essentially more copies of it, because you want to see that card as frequently as possible in an Olga build, so you can get to contract. Do go ahead and use the extra will from the other Imul to play a second Magog. We're going to go swing in for 14 at this point with the Imul. He goes to cast a Dark Alice to serve as a blocker. And we're going to go ahead and just let him draw. Discards the Angel, which is certainly a good reanimate target if he chooses to go for contract next turn. Has a couple prevalence of famishment and does decide to discard the Rhea. Goes to block and we say that is absolutely fine. We're going to swing in with Sherry because she's currently at 8-9, so the wolf won't be able to block her effectively. Keeping in mind that the wolf is certainly going to be able to try to attack, kill us next turn because we have things that have famine, and so that's just something to be in mind of. But we do get to get him down to 3,000 damage and then just ship the turn. The best part about it is we're just sitting on this extra will potential by just cracking that Stowed, which gets us to access to like double darkness, which is really, really huge to be able to keep Dan's board cleared. And this is kind of the thing about Imul is like she generates a lot of value and a lot of board control so that you can leave your cancels and your sort of progressions and things like end of the book and stuff like that for things that really matter, whereas the Imul itself will just keep ourselves protected. As he chooses to go into combat, we're going to go ahead and use the Sunstone to go search for another sword or Stone of Progress. Sword of Progress is going to trigger both Imuls. We're going to produce an extra 2 darkness, and we're going to use both of those darknesses to then go ahead and apply a -8 to Dan's board. Now he could go to try to Goddard with Child of Famine to survive it, but we're Ulga, so we have the child to be able to cancel a Goddard. So he's not in great shape here. So it is going to go ahead and just apply that -8 to his board and get rid of the Wolf of Famine and keep our board safe. Do see he has a Joan to Arc in hand. It wouldn't be necessarily a bad card to be able to cast right now, kill one of the Replicant Imuls, but the problem is that she's going to come into play and be immediately dead. So we're going to see a Prevalence of Famishment come out. No +1/+1 counters to remove, unfortunately, but he does get to kill one of the Replicant Imuls and then just has to deal with the rest of them on board. You see there's a Locust. That Locust would just immediately die. There's a Contract, the Gene. All of those would just immediately die. Not a lot of instant speed interaction in that hand from Dan. So after draw before recovery, we're going to get to go ahead and do a lot of hand sculpting, and then we are probably just going to be able to swing in for lethal if this board isn't better for him. Having even one Imul right now, this represented damage on board, hitting a that one Imul is 14. Each of the Shaherazads is 8 and then 6, so that's another 14, so down to 22 or down to 2 life, and then we have, you know, Little Maria and Feasting to be able to push out the game. So swinging in, and Dan says, yeah, you got it, we'll scoop it up, and we can go into game 2. So in game 2 here, Dan choosing to take the coin again. Hopefully this time he can kind of stick some of the early kind of pressure pieces, such as something like locusts could be a little bit better, or being able to fight over some of the starlit canopies. Just something to be able to not be so reliant on me committing stuff to board. You know, Joan is an okay resonator, but she works best when your opponent has stuff. Famished Wolf is a 4-drop unless your opponent has stuff. And so those are just not the kind of resonators that Dan wants me to, like, Dan wants to rely on in this matchup, because they're just not going to be able to stick around for long, and it's going to take him a long time to even be able to get them on field. Seeing the Sunstone right off the bat, I'm just going to let him burn himself down there. We're totally fine with that. Letting him go get another stone, and we do see that first locusts come down, so a much better start in terms of being able to at least respond to some of the things that I'm doing, kind of keep my board cleared. It's an easy way for him to kill the Replicant Imul once it gets going before, you know, it has a chance to be able to potentially get those triggers off. Hitting a Sword of Progress on turn 2. Moving into recovery, again, not playing a Resonator. Hits another Sunstone, so it's going to have to hurt himself again, which I'm sure Dan does not like here in this matchup. Down to 36. We're going to see, it looks like we're going to see a line that was very similar to what he did last time, which is to try to get that Magog off board through the use of another Starlit Canopy. Pretty good card, especially, you know, if he had a flute, it would be best here. Trying to think about exactly how I want to respond to this, and whether I'm going to try to let him hit my Magog or try to protect it so that we can keep the Magog around. That is the biggest piece here. We don't have a cancel for it. We are going to try to respond to its enter effect, though, just to see, yes, he's clearly targeting the Magog. We got to try to keep it around. Because the thing about Starlit Canopy is it's not like if I remove Starlit Canopy, he gets to come back. It's just gone forever. And so with that in mind, we're going to be responding to the Starlit Canopy effect to target Magog. Flash in a Melfi, using this Melfi to help us kind of cycle a little bit and produce some extra will to be able to respond. We're going to go ahead and also use the Magog before we draw, just to kind of see what we might draw into. Or maybe afterwards. In response to the effect, it looks like we produce red and green, and we're going to actually use the Killua spell with both modes. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and cancel his automatic trigger, and we're going to put an ice counter on our Sunchild and draw a card. So just even more cycling here to keep our Magog around. We can't destroy the addition because we are doing the canceling, but at the same time, it's fine either way because Dan doesn't have a way to put +1/+1 counters on it right now, so it's just not going to provide him much assistance. Gonna go ahead and cast a second Magog here just so that, you know, future Starlit Canopies are not as much of a concern. It takes him an even bigger hurdle to be able to stop us from casting Sword of Progressions effectively, and then we'll just pass. Melfi absolutely getting eaten by the locusts. Now he does have the stone, so this is pretty good for him, you know, potentially being able to like remove the +1/+1 counters from locusts, put them on, you know, the Starlit Canopy, and then draw a card, and then use locusts again to kill something that I just put into play. Like, there is some value to be generated there. Dan just, though, continuing to hit those sun stones, forcing him to pay more life to be able to get into good stones. Probably looking like Dan might be playing 4 copies of that stone in the deck, which I think is a little excessive, but I think in the Ulga deck, we're only playing 2 total. Swings in for 6 with the Locust, and we say that's fine. Second Starlit Canopy comes down. It's going to hit one of the Magogs, and we say, you know what? That's also probably just fine. It's just important to know which Magog you're going to be going for so that we can kind of... We'll see before you resolve it if we can maybe draw into something just to do 1, and then we'll see what happens. After he responds to try to remove one of the Gogs, we'll just go ahead and filter one more time just to get the advantage before it's gone. Then we pass and draw into our turn. Before recovery, we're probably going to see that same kind of thing as Sword of Progression just to get it online to try to draw a card, set us up for being able to cast Scheherazade. We do have some extra will here, so it looks like we might be trying to play, yes, Little Maria out into the field. Little Maria at this point in time is probably going to call Sword of Progression because we haven't seen many Swords of Progression, and we are sitting on something like, you know, we have a Scheherazade in hand and stuff like that. There is a world where you say respond with end of the book as well as a potential here, because you can like cast Sherry and then use Sherry to do end of the book to recycle that sort of progression that's in my graveyard in a really weird cycling. You can also in this deck, using Little Maria, make use of like sort of regression, because you can kind of make it pseudo quick cast in a way. Ultimately, we are not choosing to do that in our build, but it is something you can do to really mess with your opponent, like during your end phase or during their end phase or something like that. Really relies a little bit heavier on generate replicant if you're going to be going that route though. Does look like we went for a sword of progression here. We're searching the deck and we are choosing to fail to find. We do have one Scarlet in the sideboard, but not in the main, but we can still search in the main and fail to find, just mainly so we can cast Sword of Progression, thanks to Little Maria, and now get up to 2. So 2 is kind of the biggest hurdle here, so now we're at, you know, the ability to bounce cancel and draw a card, but also generate replicant now gets us Scheherazade at instant speed. Like, there's just a lot of things that be gained from it. We're going to see that Stone of Famine being used to, like I said, maneuver those +1/+1 counters off of Locusts so that he can then start using it again, as well as draw an additional card from Starlit Canopy. So having just a lot of card value in hand. It's just a question of what he's going to do with it. And yeah, true, just hits the 4 stones back to back to back to back, and has to pay himself down to 32 to see all of his stones there. I'm thinking about whether or not I want to try to cancel that, but I only have, like, Feasting would be the only thing in the deck that can let me do that, and I only have 1 edition, so it would be pretty hard pressed to get the value from that. Does have a Damascus Moon. That doesn't super help right now because Magog just has to exist. It doesn't have to be named. Does play a second Locust, so really does get to start eating up the hand. This is pretty good, particularly because I have the Little Maria. Yeah, you see him just going to go ahead and try to eat the Little Maria right now. I think this is a little bit of an being too proactive, because I think I was telegraphing pretty hard that I was going to be abusing Little Maria a little bit here. And so now he's going to do Generate Replicant in response to Little Maria getting killed, which means I can cast another Sword of Progression and draw another card and get myself to Sword of Progression cast number 4. This also lets me get Scheherazade, which lets me get a Replicant Imol from the sideboard. And now we could have cast Sword of Progression there, but ultimately what we're doing instead is we are going to go ahead and take advantage of Replicant Imol, saying, look, Little Maria's done her job, we will let her die. We're going to go ahead and apply a neg4 to your board with Replicant Imol before your stuff gains those +1/+1 counters, so that, sure, you'll kill Little Maria, but both of your Locusts will be dead. So really kind of keeping that field clear. And if he does want to play that Famished Wolf that he has, it's not going to be very big. It'll be a 4/4. And that'll be a problem. Thinking about if he wants to try to do something in response, maybe to try to protect something or add +1/+1 counters maybe. Does ultimately, though, just choose to let the neg4 get played. Down comes that Damascus Moon. I don't really know why this was played, to be honest, because it turns off his own Starlit Canopies. So, like, yeah, I don't get to filter as much, but he also doesn't have an additional source of draw power. So that just seemed a little unnecessary. Does go in for another Famished Wolf, and we're going to see a repeat of the play from last game, which is just to make our stuff not have Famine, so he can't try to kill it when he swings in here, even if he does choose to swing in. It's a 4/4, but it's doubtful that he would swing in right now, but even just to be safe, we're going to go ahead and use Child of Famine to put the +1/+1 counters on all of them. In response, we're going to see a coin pop here to do Prevalence of Famishment. He could have used the 2 +1/+1 counters from his addition instead of using the coin, just because of the alternate cost of Prevalence, but ultimately did just decide to kill the Imol before she gets the counters, and then it goes to my turn. Once again, choosing to go for a Little Maria here. I believe this Little Maria is going to go ahead and call end of the book as its kind of ability to be able to search off of Legacy Boost. And the reason why is because we have a generate replicant. So generate replicant is going to do the whole cycle over again of generating us another Scheherazade, which is going to get us an Imul, so we can call a stone, so we can get value. But while we're searching, we can cast End of Book, and we're going to do this in a cool sequence. So the replicant Scheherazade will get grabbed, and then End of Book will be used. We can even pay for it with the Scheherazade that we're like about to cast, I think is how that could work with Mastery. And then in response to the End of the Book, we're gonna pop one of his additions. Probably the one that has the +1/+1 counters would be the one to destroy. Ultimately, we chose not to. In response to the End of the Book, we're going to use Scheherazade's effect to move the sort of progression from the bottom of the graveyard back, or from the graveyard to the bottom of the deck. End of Book resolves, pops the addition, moves the sort of progression back to the top of my deck. We get to draw that card, and then Scheherazade also then gets me another replicant Imul from the sideboard. And then we get to call another stone, and it generates us some will, and we get to do all kinds of cool value stuff here. So like, we spent 2 will to do that, just to kind of keep that in mind, that the sequencing of Ulga can be particularly chaotic once you get Sword of Progress online, but if you can figure it out, it really, really opens up the deck to being able to apply pressure in a way that is kind of unexpected. In response to the swing, we're going to go ahead and just apply a -4/-4 to the board, just to make sure that our Scheherazade takes as little damage as possible, just in case there's something up Dan's sleeve. And then we can sit on 3 will going into his turn. Really kind of just threatening lethal on this next turn, even from just the bodies on field, because we have 2 8/8s, a 6/6, a 4/4, and a 10/10 with the replicant Imul. So let's go ahead and use that Prevalence of Famishment. Once again, missing out on the opportunity to do the alternative cost. Hand looks unfortunately pretty dead for Dan. Looks like a Dark Alice. A Famished Wolf is not going to do much here, as well as the card to be able to add +1/+1 counters. Commits to the Famished Wolf. We say we're going to pay 1. We're going to go ahead and do Sword of Progression to bounce his addition back to his hand, cancel, and draw a card. Up to 3 Swords of Progression cast, and you saw that we do have that 4th one in hand, so if Dan decides to try to make another move here, we can kind of hard punish it, especially if he decides to try to tap out. The hand has like 0 draw power in it at this point in time, so we're pretty well stocked to be able to push the game next turn. Canopy doesn't even help him right now because of the Damascus Moon, so there's not really a reason to cast it. Really, his only option is that Dark Alice, but that's not going to get him very far if we happen to have another Sword of Progress in hand. At the end of the turn, we do indeed just have Sword of Progress in hand, doing the modes to draw a card and contract. Again, this is all possible because of the errata on Sword of Progression that took away that having to cast cards in chronological order. And so now we have Genesis Chronogear. And so good old Big O is in the field and ready to just kind of push through for lethal next turn, with all of the stones as well being able to be... all of the stones are able to be resonators as well. And so there's just way more than 3,000 damage here represented. I have 3 of the stones, so they among themselves are just 4,500 damage, plus Big O, Genesis Chronogear with his 2,000. So that is going to be the game when we go into combat here. It's just a matter of executing it, going in here. Anytime we take him below 2,000 life, Genesis Chronogear has flying, so that will also just be able to finish the game here too. Precision, flying, barrier, and pierce and eternal. He goes to cast a Dark Alice, even though it doesn't super matter, maybe just to draw into something. You'll see him, he like spent the will and hasn't played the card down yet. Goes to play a Dark Alice here, but just to add insult to injury to say, look, you're not even going to get to do that. We have Kilo a spell in hand, and we are just going to cancel its automatic ability and close the game. So that is it. The deck profile for the Ulga lists will be up later this week. We're going to take another look at Drei and see some other options to be able to play him and showcase him again in the coming weeks. But I thank Dan so much for being able to sit down and record this game to show off Ulga. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, this is DMO73 saying class dismissed.